What's up, people of world history? This is Mr. Chitwood. Today we are going to be talking about the French Revolution, something that lasted roughly between 1789 and 1799. So we're going to be moving away from that time period in which we're talking about the American Revolution and how trying to understand how the Enlightenment and those specific philosophers like John Locke and Rousseau and Wollstonecraft had influenced people like John Adams and George Washington and Thomas Paine to really advocate for the British colonists' independence and maintaining their own sovereign states. So what we're going to be kind of echoing here within the French Revolution is this idea of people fighting for their independence, fighting for what they believe in, fighting specifically based on the principles and the ideas of the Enlightenment. And that kind of brings us to our essential question for this unit, that is, how did Enlightenment thinkers influence the ideas and outcomes of both the American and French Revolution? So you'll remember that last week we kind of took care of the American Revolution through our film series on John Adams and also our examination of the Declaration of Independence. Primarily this week, we're going to be spent trying to understand how Enlightenment thinkers did the same thing as they did in the American Revolution, but influenced the principles and ideas and events of the French Revolution. So that's where we're going to go. We're going to be talking about this idea of the French Revolution, and here. All right, so this idea of the French Revolution was built on this principles of kind of similar to what we know from our American Revolution study, that is people being kind of oppressed, being told what to do when they felt like they shouldn't be told what to do, and also fighting for these ideas of equality, liberty, freedom, and unity as well. And we're going to see these same themes kind of echo in the French Revolution, as it undoubtedly did get some influence from the American Revolution itself, but we're going to argue in this class that the Enlightenment kind of shaped the foundation for both of those events rather than just the American Revolution sparking what happened in France. They're not mutually exclusive, but we're going to be focusing more on the Enlightenment. So this idea of the French Revolution comes about kind of, if you've ever seen the movie Les Mis, Les Miserables, the storyline is basically set within the French Revolution, in which you have a severe impoverished portion of the population. What we're going to find out later is that in the during the French Revolution, basically 95% of the people in France were living at or near the poverty line, were being heavily taxed by the government, and that kind of sparked this idea of a revolution to occur. But what I want to start at before is I want us to kind of take a minute to pause and kind of just think. I want you guys to think in your heads, and this would also be a great time to set up your notes if you haven't already. Maybe jot down some ideas during this video, but where I want you to start here is to think about this warm-up. I want you guys to match the Enlightenment philosopher to the best match, that is the letter. So if you think Voltaire was C or Voltaire was D, just kind of jot that down in your notes somewhere. So go ahead and take maybe a minute to 2 minutes to match those. You might want to pause the video for right now, and then we'll pick it up here in about a minute. All right, so before we begin, it might be a good idea for you to kind of go back through your Enlightenment book to understand, if you haven't already, which specific Enlightenment philosopher these match up to. But what I want us to keep in mind is these philosophers' ideas and how they might be influencing what we're seeing over the next 10 minutes of this video lecture about the French Revolution. So let's talk about the effects of the Enlightenment. The effects of the Enlightenment begin with this idea that government should be shaped around this idea of democracy, that people should be ruling. And we kind of see this come about with the American Revolution, with how the framers or the founders of the United States really kind of put it into the language of the Declaration of Independence that it should be that government should be this kind of contract, this social contract, as we've seen throughout the Enlightenment, that the people do not exist to serve the government exists to serve the people. And we also will see this echo again as we get to the tail end of this unit when we get to talking about Latin American revolutions as well. And this is sparking growing unrest in France because the people in France are saying, hey, this sounds awesome. This sounds like what we need. And they're starting to see this happen abroad across the Atlantic Ocean. And they're seeing that the British colonists are gaining their independence, and that this is kind of starting to grow some unrest in France as well. Before we get any further, we need to have an understanding of what French society looked like. French society was divided into 3 classes of people. They were called estates. The first estate was made up primarily of the Catholic Church, officials and clergy. The second estate was nobility and aristocracy. And the third estate was this fancy word called the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie is one of my top 5 words that I get to say throughout the year in world history. It is also a pretty important one because it kind of refers to this, it has a fluidity in terms of meaning. On the whole, it kind of represents the middle to lower class. In this sense, we're kind of understanding the bourgeoisie as being the third estate that is primarily made up of educated city lawyers, doctors, and businessmen. And that kind of was this lower class of the third estate. And then you have the lower of the lower third class, that is peasants and farmers. So this kind of social triangle kind of makes up the French society in terms of estates: the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. So let's talk about the first estate a little bit more. What we see in the first estate is, like I said, it was made up primarily of the clergy and church officials. They owned roughly 10% of the land, but made up only 1% of the population. And these people also did not have to pay taxes, so they were free from having to pay taxes to the government, to the French government. Therefore, were free to live their lives without paying any type of tax. The second estate made up roughly 3% of the population and owned 20% of the land. And again, this second estate was not made to pay taxes either. They roughly were in charge of controlling the government and lived off the collected tax money of what we will see here on this next slide of the third estate, who is going to be the only estate or section or population of society that was made to pay taxes. However, the third estate made up roughly 95% of the population. And in addition to that, they almost had no say in government whatsoever. They had to pay all the taxes, and they also had to pay tithes, which is kind of like a donation in this sense, where it's going to be more of like a very highly suggested and mandated tithe to the church, or donation to the church. So what we're going to see, or what we should be seeing in terms of the breakdown of French society, is that the third estate is obviously the largest estate, but they seem to have to bear the brunt of the economic costs, the economic taxes for most of society in France. And then we got to talk about a couple other people. King Louis the 16th, to be specific. King Louis the 16th was the ruler of France during this time period that we're going to be talking about. He is considered an absolute monarch, but was often referred to as a weak ruler. He kind of attempted some reforms in terms of trying to kind of put some of this Enlightenment ideas to rest, not necessarily trying to brush them off. He wasn't necessarily an enlightened despot, but he did notice that there was a necessity to kind of think about how he could bring about some reforms for his people, but they all kind of died in their kind of beginning phases. But the biggest thing that King Louis the 16th probably did in terms of ruining the economy of France for the people was his construction of the Palace of Versailles. This, as we're going to see over the next couple slides, is going to kind of highlight to us how extravagant this palace was that he lived in with his wife, but also how much debt it's going to put into the French economy for simply him to be able to live in while everybody else was living on the streets. So welcome to MTV Cribs. This is King Louis's MTV Crib episode. He's got roughly 2,300 rooms in this palace. Yes, I said that right. 2,300 rooms, over 550,000 square feet, roughly 6,000 paintings lived within the halls and the rooms of this palace, and roughly 2,000 sculptures as well. He had, it was no kind of rarity to see this kind of courtyard as the one that you're seeing pictured in this one right here. This is actually, if you're an Assassin's Creed video game fan, this is, I think it's Assassin's Creed Unity. You had to scale the walls across the, kind of like the roof here. In a mission on that game, but that's just an interesting side note. What we are kind of seeing here, though, is that it's a very lavish from the outside building. They paid attention to every single little bit of detail, obviously, and it looks absolutely fantastic, but all things come at a price. So one of the most recognizable aspects of the Palace of Versailles, still to this day, was the Hall of Mirrors. And there's actually a really interesting story behind the Hall of Mirrors. You can see just from its first look, this is absolutely fantastic. It looks beautiful. Everything has its place, and everything was precisely designed to look as aesthetically pleasing as possible. And King Louis was so impressed when he finally got to see the construction of this finished. He was so impressed with the workers that he was afraid that nobody else, he did not want anybody else in the world to have something like this. So what he did is he actually ordered the construction workers of the Hall of Mirrors to actually be executed so that they could not ever create something like this for anybody else again. So unfortunately for the workers, they were not able to obviously live their lives and continue the construction of beautiful works of art like this, and selfishly King Louis decided to have them executed for his own personal gain. This is a snapshot of the king's bedroom. Obviously you can see that everything is laced with gold. Everything is obviously pretty bougie, to the point where there's even a fence in front of the bed. This is also kind of another interesting story in the sense that the fence, I did not learn this until maybe I think a year or two ago, but the fence is actually kind of like a safety feature, so that if you're sleeping in the bed like King Louis might be, you would hear maybe an intruder would have to jump over the fence, and you might hear them and at least have some sort of warning that somebody might be trying to come in, assassinate you or try to harm you in any way. So the fence in front of the bed is actually an interesting safety measure that was inputted into some of these rooms in the Palace of Versailles, kind of like the one that you see here in the Queen's bedroom as well. Obviously, again, everything laced with gold, fine material, cost a lot of money. This is the Royal Chapel. Again, they spared no expense when it came to the construction of this place. It looks beautiful. Everything is aesthetically pleasing. There is gold accents everywhere. Everywhere you see these rooms within the Palace of Versailles that are laced with gold and constructed in a way that obviously costs a lot of money, was at the same time taking its toll on the people of France, as they're kind of also knowing that this is being constructed. Once it actually does end up becoming finished, and the people knowing that this is here, and they weren't allowed to hang out in the palace. Nobody that was not allowed to come here by the king was allowed to go. So many people within French society started to see this as a complete waste of money, and obviously if they're not benefiting from it and only one person is, how morally right is that if they're starving, can't afford a loaf of bread, why is it that King Louis is able to live in such a lavish mansion when 95% of the population is starving? So having an understanding of where King Louis and his wife, the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, who was also a big spender, having an understanding of where they lived while the rest of the 95% of the people in the French Revolution time period were living and starving, is going to be important for us to understand when we try to interpret why people went about their days and tried to begin this revolution. Another quick story is that it says right here, "Let them eat cake." Well, that's kind of a reference that's not necessarily a quote that she actually is attributed with. It's more so something that kind of resembles her kind of being disconnected from society. So the story goes is that she heard that the people of France were starving and they couldn't even afford a loaf of bread. And she's so removed from society, from what's actually going on in France, because they're living in this nice big palace with all their needs met, that she said, well, if they can't eat bread, if they can't afford bread, let them eat cake, and kind of laughed it off. And this has kind of been this kind of running reference since that time period, that Marie Antoinette was kind of just this person that was so far removed from the understanding of what was actually going on in society, and really could care less about what was actually happening. The next portion of this video is that we're going to be transitioning to trying to understand how the French Revolution came about and what exactly happened. So Abbé Sieyès was a member of the EstatesGeneral and basically began this kind of discussion about how the French people could take power within their society, and inspired the Third Estate to seek this power. He has a quote that's attributed to him that is, "What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been in political order? Nothing. What does it desire to be? Something." So what Abbé Sieyès is kind of identifying here is that the most important portion, the biggest aspect of French society is the people, and the 95% of the people makes up the majority. That is the Third Estate. So they are important, and he's trying to advocate for them and say that they need to take power themselves to take their country back. So the EstatesGeneral is a existing type of representation that the French people had to voice their opinion, but there were some problems with it. They rarely met. They had roughly only one vote per estate, and the Third Estate was always outvoted because the First and the Second Estate had made up a majority compared to the rest. So this created a problem in terms of French society, in terms of the Third Estate feeling like they had representation. In turn, the Third Estate looking for ways to grab power, and they created this thing called the National Assembly. After they were locked out of the EstatesGeneral, basically saying that the First and Second Estate held a meeting without them there, and the Third Estate said, you know what, fine, you can lock us out, we're just going to create our own congregation of people, and that we're going to call it the National Assembly. And they signed what was called the Tennis Court Oath, that creates a National Assembly where they would issue what we're going to read later on this week called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, very similar to what we kind of see that is presented in the Declaration of Independence, but it's more so declaring rights of the people rather than just declaring independence. And this sparks a period of great fear for the people of the First and Second Estate, where peasants are rioting throughout France, and the nobles' homes are being ransacked by the Third Estate. You have this kind of calamitous time period in the French Revolution where the people are actually taking action against the First and Second Estates, the powers that be, kind of like we saw in the American Revolution. And eventually coming to a pass with the storming of the Bastille, which was a prison in Paris that held a whole bunch of the arms and munitions for society during the time period. It was a symbol of royal authority, and it begins the revolution in July 14th of 1789, which is also kind of symbolic of something similar to what we know as the Independence Day or the 4th of July in the United States. So the storming of the Bastille kind of tips the revolution over the edge and begins this time period of intense chaos and ultimately some bloodshed, and this transition of power to this guy named Robespierre that begins this power rule of the Reign of Terror, where there's mass executions of enemies of the revolution. He sends ultimately thousands to the guillotine, where people get their heads chopped off, and is an advocate for the poor, for democratic institutions. But we will see next week or next episode how this is actually not going to turn out to be as peachy as we think it might be. So having said that, we're going to end this episode for you today. Don't forget to go on to Edmodo and fill out that Microsoft form talking about your understanding and the notes from both this video lecture and also the crash course video that we had asked that you watch as well. So if you like this video, give me a like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, and have a fantastic day. We'll see you guys next time.